on trade association in the economy of industrial Europe. And the first session is going to be dedicated to the definitions and typologies of corporations, of guilds. We have 4 papers, 4 communications. We will present all the communication. Then we will stop for a coffee break. You can drink something else, not just coffee, of course. And there will be the final discussion at the end. The first presentation will be delivered by Professor Onur Yildirim of the Technological University of Ankara, Turkey. He will be speaking of the guilds in the social economic system of the Ottoman Empire. Please, you go ahead.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? I can speak loud. Yeah, no, it works.
I don't think it's on.
Okay. I don't know why. Okay. Now it works. Okay, good morning, everybody. I'm going to be speaking about the guilds in the Ottoman Empire, so I'm really not sure if it's the best area and the best place to start the discussion on the guilds in Europe, but I'll do my best to sort of square it with the general discussion here on the European guilds. I'm a fast speaker, and I'll do my best to sort of control myself. But the paper that I have here is not particularly original. This is sort of a brief and concise summary of the research that I have conducted over nearly 3 decades on Ottoman economic history and the guilds. My presentation basically takes stock of the findings I have obtained and the arguments I have put forward in my research in this field. And I will be essentially presenting a summary of a long text that I have already written in Turkish, which was recently published in an edited volume titled The Return of Economic History. Wherever there's a call for a return, I am always there. So I was also part of the volume on the return of the guilds. So the volume that was published in honor of Professor Stephen Epstein's scholarship some years ago, I also contributed to that volume with an article on Ottoman guilds. Right at the outset, I'd like to sort of state clearly that as merchants and artisans in various regions and cities of the Ottoman Empire organized themselves with an exclusive or monopolistic logic to dominate markets, similar to their counterparts in Europe. Within the scope and the opportunities granted to them by political authorities, these organizations dominated the urban economy throughout the early modern period and even beyond. I should mention here that the state actually subjected urban artisans and their guilds to a specific hierarchical ranking based on its provisioning priorities for major cities, primarily the capital city, Istanbul. When we consider the exclusive role of the state in the procurement and distribution of raw materials, it must be clearly emphasized that this ranking was not merely a nominal arrangement. Given that the artisan groups specialized in the production of strategic goods topped this list, we can easily state that they manipulated their position to take refuge under the state's protection whenever they faced any kind of threat. This point takes on a particular significance in the 18th century, an environment where European merchants moved about freely across the Ottoman geography. As I will briefly discuss below, the guilds, protected by the state, weathered the European storm with far less damage compared to the local guilds that declined under the shadow of the Industrial Revolution. The relationship between the guild and the state, which I will discuss in part below, took place within a framework where, unlike in Europe, guild members did not have much say or any direct participation in the administration of their cities or in general administrative processes. Furthermore, as I will touch upon, although there were regional differences in the status of guilds regarding key issues such as organizational form, hierarchical structure, and their roles in pricing, there was never a profound difference in their relations with the state. Please do not interpret this point as an argument that Ottoman guilds were inherently unique or should be viewed as entirely distinct from their European counterparts. It is true that they did not actively participate in urban governance and general administrative processes like their European peers. However, I'd like to emphasize here that as economic entities, they were effectively no less significant than their counterparts in the processes of production and distribution. At this point, I can return to my study. So this was like the fair introduction, of which I previously shared a brief summary with you. My contribution to this conference actually offers a comprehensive historiographical and analytical synthesis that repositions Ottoman guilds within both Ottoman studies and global economic history. At the core of my argument is a sustained challenge to long-standing narratives of stagnation and decline that have shaped the field for decades. Rather than seeing the guilds as static remnants of a pre-modern order, I reconstruct them as adaptive, dynamic institutions embedded in complex and evolving market structures. I argue that these guilds continuously negotiated economic pressures, social tensions, and state interventions from the 16th to the 19th century, and that they must be understood as historically contingent organizations whose trajectories were shaped by both internal dynamics and external transformations. A central contribution of my paper basically lies in its critique of earlier historiographical frameworks, which have often imposed rigid interpretive models on a far more fluid historical reality. I begin by revisiting influential interpretations of Ottoman markets, particularly those associated with Fernand Braudel and Halil İnalcık. While I acknowledge Braudel's pioneering effort to integrate the Ottoman Empire into a global history of early modern economies, I argue that his bazaar economy model ultimately flattens the complexity of Ottoman economic life. By emphasizing tradition-bound exchange, transparency, and the absence of competitive expansion, Braudel's framework risks portraying Ottoman markets as inherently static. Moreover, his reliance on an ambiguous notion of centralized political authority produces internal contradictions, especially when he simultaneously suggests that economic life could remain resilient despite political decline. Similarly, I subject Halil İnalcık's Near Eastern statecraft model to critical research. While his work remains foundational and critical, I argue that his portrayal of guilds as tightly controlled, anti-competitive institutions reflects an essentialist understanding of Ottoman economic practices. In his model, artisans are positioned as subjects of strict state regulation, in contrast to merchants who are granted relative freedom. Yet, this dichotomy, I suggest, is based less on systematic empirical evidence than on impressionistic readings of normative sources. As a result, it obscures the diversity of practices and the flexibility that I think characterize many guilds in different regions and periods. In both Braudel's and İnalcık's frameworks, I find a tendency to privilege coherence over complexity, leading to interpretations that fail to capture the dynamic nature of Ottoman economic institutions. Against these interpretations, I emphasize the heterogeneity of Ottoman markets and institutions. I argue that neither the market nor the guild system can be understood as uniform across the empire's vast and varied geography. The Ottoman world, stretching from the Balkans to North Africa and the Middle East, encompassed a wide range of ecological zones, urban configurations, and social structures. In this context, regional conditions, local power relations, and sectoral specificities played a decisive role in shaping economic organization. My insistence on diversity is not merely descriptive. It constitutes a methodological intervention aimed at moving the field beyond abstract, empire-wide generalizations toward more localized and empirically grounded analysis. Only by reconstructing the micro-level functioning of guilds can we begin to understand the macro-level significance. Within this revised framework, I reassess the evolution of guild historiography and highlight both its achievements and its limitations. Early studies, often shaped by Orientalist assumptions, fail to situate Ottoman guilds within concrete socioeconomic contexts. Instead, they subsumed these institutions under a vague and ahistorical categories such as Islamic society, Islamic city, or Middle Eastern tradition. From the mid-20th century onward, however, particularly in the last 3-4 decades, a new generation of scholars, including myself, began to reconstruct guilds as integral components of urban economic life across the empire. And this shift certainly marked an important departure as researchers increasingly relied on archival materials to examine the internal organization and social function of guilds. Yet despite these advances, I argue that the literature has remained limited in its ability to address fundamental questions of economic history. In particular, we still lack systematic analysis of production processes, market integration, and long-term economic change. The persistence of the decline thesis, most prominently articulated by a Turkish economic historian, exemplifies these limitations. According to this narrative, Ottoman guilds were unable to compete with the expanding industrial economies of Europe and thus entered a prolonged period of stagnation as early as the 16th century. And this view became deeply embedded in the broader paradigm of Ottoman decline, reinforcing a teleological interpretation of economic history. I challenge this narrative again by drawing on more recent scholarship, particularly the work of Donald Quattart and Süreyya Faruqi and Önjörnyi, and several others, influenced more by labor and social history oriented approaches. These studies have demonstrated that guilds were far more flexible and resilient than previously assumed. Rather than passively succumbing to external pressures, they adapted to shifting market conditions. They reorganized their internal structures and continue to play a significant role in urban economies well into the modern times. Building on this literature, I propose a more complex trajectory of development characterized by cycles of contraction, expansion, and transformation. And this perspective is further reinforced by the work of another Turkish economic historian, Mehmet Genç, whose sectoral analysis reveals a highly uneven pattern of economic performance, thereby undermining any notion of a uniform or irreversible decline. A major theme running through my paper, I mean, it's a really long paper, and I will submit it hopefully next month or so, is my critique of the long-standing debate over state control versus guild autonomy. I argue that this dichotomy has dominated the literature to the point of exhaustion without yielding substantive insights into the actual functioning of guilds. Early scholars, such as Gabriel Bayer, portrayed guilds as extensions of the state apparatus, emphasizing their role in regulation and control. In contrast, later researchers highlighted their autonomy, pointing to evidence of internal decision-making and collective organization. However, as I demonstrate, both positions rely on limited and often anecdotal evidence, leading to sweeping generalizations that obscure more than they reveal. More importantly, I contend that this debate diverts attention from more fundamental questions about production, labor relations, and market behavior. Whether guilds were autonomous or state control is in many ways the wrong question. What matters is how they operated in practice, how they organized labor, managed resources, negotiated with authorities, and responded to economic change. By reframing guilds as institutions that function through continuous negotiation and interaction with the state and other actors, I aim to move beyond binary categorizations and toward a more process-oriented understanding of their role within Ottoman society. The most original and forward-looking part of my analysis concerns the transformation of guilds in the 18th century, particularly through the institution of Gedik. I argue that the Gedik system represents a key moment of institutional innovation that sheds light on the adaptive capacity of guilds. Initially designed to secure artisans' rights to operate in specific trades or locations, that is like strengthening the barrier to entry, the gedik gradually evolved into a form of transferable and marketable property. This transformation had far-reaching implications. On the one hand, it strengthened the position of master artisans by formalizing their claims and creating barriers to entry. On the other hand, as gediks became commodified and entered secondary markets, they attracted non-artisan investors and began to function as financial assets. I showed that this process fundamentally altered the relationship between economic rights and guild membership. As ownership of gediks became detached from participation in production, the collective mechanisms that had sustained guild organization began to erode. In this sense, the gedik emerges as both a mechanism of adaptation and a vector of disintegration and dissolution. It illustrates how institutional innovation, while initially reinforcing the position of artisans, could generate unintended consequences that ultimately undermine the very structures it was meant to support. This dual character makes the gedik a particularly valuable lens through which to analyze the broader transformation of Ottoman economic institutions in the 18th century. Throughout my analysis, I repeatedly underscored the limitations imposed by the available sources, which continue to constrain our understanding of Ottoman economic history. The absence of systematic quantitative data on production, prices, and labor makes it difficult to trace the long-term development of guilds with precision. Archival materials, while rich in qualitative detail, are often fragmented and not designed for economic analysis. As a result, many key questions regarding output levels, income distribution, technological change, and market integration remain unresolved. This recognition of evidentiary constraints is not merely methodological. It also serves as a critique of earlier scholarship that advanced sweeping claims without sufficient empirical grounding. In my conclusion, I situate Ottoman guilds within broader debates on economic history and global development. I argue that unlike their European counterparts, Ottoman guilds have not been adequately integrated into discussions of economic growth, capitalism, and technological change. This omission reflects both the limitations of the sources and the historiographical marginalization of early modern industry within Ottoman studies. At the same time, it points to a significant opportunity. By bringing Ottoman guilds into conversations with global historiography, we can begin to challenge Eurocentric narratives and develop more inclusive models of economic development. Ultimately, I redefine Ottoman guilds as historically contingent, adaptive institutions whose trajectories cannot be reduced to narratives of decline or rigid traditionalism. By combining historiographical critique with analytical perspectives, I aim not only to revise our understanding of Ottoman economic history, but also to contribute to a more pluralistic and comparative approach to the study of pre-modern labor organizations. In doing so, I hope to open new avenues for research that will allow us to better understand the complex and multifaceted role that the guilds played in shaping the economic and social fabric of the Ottoman Empire. That's the talk. It's almost 20 minutes.
Grazie per il panorama dell'impero ottomano e grazie per il tempo. Allora passiamo al professore Andrea Caracausi.
So now we have Professor Caracausi from the University of Padua. He will talk to us about organizational models and power dynamics, corporation typology in medieval and modern Italy. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So the trades and cooperation played an important role in medieval Italy of pre-industrial economy. They had wide monopolies, technology influenced also the trades, and also further influences. They still are present today, from apprenticeship and license of exercise, restriction on mobility, right through the gender inequalities and links with political power. The Italian case is a prime laboratory for the longevity and vitality of the art, for institutional diversity, for possible comparisons between organizational types and relations with authorities. Historiography has generally oscillated between negative and positive assessment. In general, views range from seeing guilds as institutions that resolved information asymmetries to bodies useful for manipulating regulations and redistributing wealth within the group. Here we are. However, any assessment of their economic role cannot ignore considerations regarding the multiplicity of corporate forms, from their internal complexity to the presence or absence of administrative bodies and apparatus, from their relations with political power to the ways in which political power utilized them. In a corporate society where legal pluralism was the norm, there were moreover hierarchies and sources of law to which actors could turn and refer. Judicial and regulatory overlaps were numerous, with clear implications for their capacity for action. This report aims to focus on the various organizational forms generally referred to as guilds, examining their structure, internal regulations, and links with the authorities. The research questions are straightforward. What was the structure of the guild? What was its relationship with authorities? What consequences might these two factors have on the guild's activities? To avoid remaining solely at the regulatory level, I shall draw on some evidence regarding the guild's attitude towards apprenticeship, one of the area perhaps most discussed in recent historiography. The presentation is largely based on secondary literature and on the database originally compiled by the research group coordinated by Angelo Moioli, and subsequently incorporated, albeit in part, into European-level comparative database by the University of Utrecht under the coordination of Luca Muccarelli. The database covers 1,385 guilds across the sample of 50 Italian cities, which in at least 3 time series 1300, 1400, 1500, 1600, 1700, 1800 had populations exceeding 10,000. The information available ranges from demographic data to internal dynamics and relationships with the authorities. The next section will provide a brief summary of the general evolution of the guild phenomenon in Italy. The third section will consider the type of guilds. The fourth, the links with the authorities. So, the evolution. We have a greater concentration in the north, 70% of all guilds, followed by the south and the island, 15%, recovering after a late start, and the center, 14%. The density of guilds also increased over the centuries, rising from 1 guild per 6,800 inhabitants to 1 guild per 1,800, reaching 1 guild per 1,700 inhabitants. A clear phenomenon that emerges from the earliest stages is the lack of uniformity across the territory, and in particular the divergence between the north and south of the peninsula between the 13th and 15th century. During the modern era, the increase did not stem from the separation of existing guilds, but from the establishment of new institutions, with the textile and clothing sector being most effective. Now, which guilds, types, and varieties? Beyond the numbers, the diversity of the guild system across the Italian peninsula is reflected in the types of trade guilds. In addition to the guilds whose members were united by a single occupation, at least 4 other types can be identified. So beyond the first one. The first type is a sector-based guild. As you can see, the presence of complex production chains and the technical and commercial skills required meant that guild structures emerged which went beyond the single craft stage. In these cases, we're dealing with genuine arts that encompassed various trades held together by the figures of merchants or merchant manufacturers. This is a distinctive feature of the Italian peninsula that must be borne in mind when considering the activities of these bodies. The most classic example is that of the textile industry and the art of wool working. From the early Middle Ages onwards, in many Italian cities, we see the emergence of a guild of merchant manufacturers who coordinated the production chain and were the only ones to have access to the guild council to deliberate and to deliberate and judge on behalf of the subordinates, category comprising all those engaged in the trade. Within this type of guild, the masters and mistresses of other trades had limited rights, which might include reduced entry fees, a ban or access to the council, and even the absence of apprenticeship requirement. If we look at the situation in Italian cities, these guilds we are widespread almost everywhere. Of the 32 cities with a wool guild, only 25% have more than 2 guilds. And looking at the silk guilds, however, out of a total of 26 cities, only 23% have more than 2 guilds: Bologna, Genoa, Milan, Naples, Lucca, Turin, and Venice, Massa. The system, which was not unique to the textile sector, but also applied to the building trade, became increasingly widespread during the modern era, with groups of merchants coordinating the various operations, thereby increasing the dependence of master craftsmen and workers. A second type of guild refers to the so-called supply chain guilds. Classic example is leatherworking. In cities such as Bologna, Mantua, and Treviso, the sector is highly fragmented, yet hierarchies emerge where certain trades are subordinate to others which are dominant. In this case, inter-guild relations and tensions are extremely strong, with clear repercussions on the quality and pricing of semi-finished goods, as well as on the relationship between town and country. A third category comprises umbrella guilds, which encompasses trades that are very different in nature. The haberdashers are a clear example of a multi-trade guild that includes regulations for other trades which do not have their own administrative autonomy. A prime example is the transport sector. In Venice, gondoliers were divided into 28 different stations. Each station was an association in its own right, with its own rules, tied to station's territory. In this case, it is appropriate to speak of a fragmented guild system with jurisdictions over the urban territory. In Turin, in other realities like in Turin, however, the emergence of a guild linked to the construction sector was driven, rather than by trade-related needs, by common origin and the control of mobility. In addition to this distinctive form, between the 15th and 18th centuries, the Italian guild system underwent a profound transformation, with the merchant entrepreneur emerging as a dominant figure, capable of altering the legal framework of the guilds to centralize control over the value chain. This evolution manifested itself in 2 forms. On the one hand, organizations in which the workforce was legally dependent on the merchant, the University of Merchants of Monza or the Silk Court in Venice. On the other hand, internal hierarchies where small groups of master craftsmen abandoned manual labor to become managers, reducing apprentices, laborers, or women to a flexible and subordinate workforce. So the pervasive presence of merchants or merchant entrepreneurs had an impact on the guild's activity. I shall attempt to offer some observations, starting with the apprenticeship system. Although this is a very rough estimate, there are indications that sector-based guilds were less rigid, at least in terms of regulations, than single-trade guilds. If we look at the total of the guilds, 60% did not require a formal apprenticeship, so a wide presence of the apprenticeship. So this holds true in many Italian cities across various historical periods. If we look at the table, apprenticeship were present, albeit with variation from one city to another, particularly in single-trade guilds. Apprenticeship were rarer in sector-based guilds, where the payment of a fee and the practice of the trade were usually required to coordinate the guild. In contrast, single-trade guilds often chose to introduce apprenticeship after the trade itself had developed. What does it mean? As earlier mentioned, the guilds were not isolated or autonomous entities, but complex organizations whose existence depended on processes of legitimization and negotiation with the political powers. So the corporations were not isolated, but complex entities subject to legitimization and negotiation processes with the political powers. A re-examination of their history reveals certain common elements that subsequently characterize their activities. As regards Central and Northern Italy between the 13th and 14th century, the guilds also exercised political power, with some notable exception from Venice, where the patriciate prevented any political influence by the arts from the very beginning, to Milan, where the artisan never held any political sway. With the rise of the signoria and the subsequent regional state, the autonomy of the arts were progressively reduced. On the other hand, the signoria used the guilds as tools to stabilize their social order. On the other, the authorities began to encroach upon the regulatory sphere of the arts, as in Verona, Palermo, and Mantua. The emerging regional states established specific supervisory bodies, which led to a loss of autonomy and self-government, the organization of internal justice, and the exercise of political representation. We have the Old and New Justice in Venice, the Assunteria delle Arti in Bologna, the Mercanzia in Siena, the Council of Commerce in Turin, and so on. A rough overview of the relationships that developed between the late Middle Ages and the early modern period shows that the sources of legitimacy for guild statutes were decidedly to the state authorities. 590 guilds, 44% of the sample in which sources of legitimacy are identified, cite state authority as their source of legitimacy, with the highest figures found in the Grand Duchy of Tuscany, 70%, and the Kingdom of Naples, 76%. There are also cases of mixed authority. Municipal states, such as in Milan, 38%, or in the Papal States, 85 cases, 53%, where there was a combination of ecclesiastical and municipal activity. Looking at the sectors, we see that those with state authority include port activities, transport, glass, manufacturing, paper manufacturing. Strategic sectors and those linked to public utility remain subject primarily to state authority alone. This relationship with the authorities also took the form of incentives to promote economic activity, from the intervention of the popes in 15th century Rome to the establishment of the Silk Guild in Mantua, to the economic policies of the House of Savoy in the early 18th century. This new relationship with authority meant that throughout the modern era, the state increasingly utilized bodies for public purposes. In both Rome and Palermo, responsibility could range from the urban policing to defense, from public health services to the annona, the so-called annona, as in Vicenza, and even to the management of hospitals, as in Florence. From the Kingdom of Naples to the Kingdom of Sardinia, from the Kingdom of Sicily to the Savoy state, the guild system took shape and found scope for managing social and political life, as well as economic and administrative affairs. Jurisdictional and internal regulations and models. The jurisdiction could comprise relations with the authorities gave rise to more local methods. Some guilds held extensive powers, particularly judicial ones, with their own codes and jurisdiction over civil and criminal matters. The best known examples are the wool guilds in Florence, Naples, Padua, and even L'Aquila, whose authority extended even to non-members if they were objectively involved in matters related to the trade. In many of these contexts, extensive jurisdictional powers were granted to groups of merchants drawn to other regions and in close alliance with local lords from as early as the 14th and 15th centuries at the time of their foundation. In many other places, however, as we have already noted, guild jurisdiction was limited or entirely absent, replaced by public courts or higher mercantile magistrates, as in Genoa, Venice, Lucca, and Arezzo. Guild jurisdiction was measured by its procedures. Summary proceeding, a type of procedure that excluded knowledge of local law and the use of lawyers, are attested in various contexts, such as in the wool trade in L'Aquila, Florence, and Padua for cases of low value, and using the instrument of the decisive oath to resolve cases. Ordinary proceedings, and in particular criminal proceedings, were restricted to few cases and became increasingly rare during the modern era. The sector-specific guild could serve to reduce internal conflict by granting power to a single body dominated by merchants. What were the implications for the ability to enforce their own laws, depending on whether they had own court or relied on external one? Here, to a comparison with their approach to apprenticeship may provide some insight. So the available empirical data show that trade guilds, even when they had their own code, were unable to guarantee the enforcement of contracts in the event of early termination. In 16th and 17th century Padua, for example, the contract enforcement rate was low. Judges rarely ordered apprentices to return to their masters or to work to make up for lost days. Apprentices were therefore not always compelled to complete their contracts. Contract enforcement rates were higher in cases where apprentices were poached by other masters. Here, however, injunctions played a more decisive role. This may indicate that injunctions succeeded in limiting the poaching of apprentices by masters, forces apprentices to return to their previous masters. In some cases, however, following injunctions, the parties were able to reach an out-of-court settlement and often did so, leaving apprentices free to work for new masters. In places where civil or special courts existed, the situation was not so different, at least at first glance. In many cases, masters preferred alternatives to forcing apprentices to return to them. A favored option, for example, was the exchange of apprentices with other masters, a provision also included in the contracts themselves, as in the case in 15th and 16th century Genoa. In many cases, moreover, failure to honor the contract stemmed from mistreatment suffered. To best justification, an apprentice could provide for leaving a master without being dismissed. The presence of an ordinary court seemed to have favored claims brought by apprentices or their guardians. In 17th century Venice, faced with the opportunism of masters, apprentices could demand their money back or obtain what they promised to them. Before the Old Court of Venice, as James Shaw points out, a particularly substantial group of wage claims come from apprentices, mostly in the manual trades. The courts, nevertheless, faced great difficulty in enforcing the continuation of contracts upon the masters themselves. The difficulty of punishing masters and merchants were therefore a problem faced by both the guild courts and the ordinary courts. Some conclusions and analysis of the organizational models of guilds in medieval and early modern Italy reveals that their structural diversity was not merely a reflection of specialization in production, but also a strategic response to specific power dynamics. Firstly, it is clear that the category of guild conceals diverse and, in many cases, profoundly asymmetrical realities. The predominance of sector-based guilds coordinated by merchant manufacturers testifies to an early capacity of commercial capital to subsume artisanal labor, transforming the guild institution into an instrument for controlling the supply chain and the associated workforce. This process of oligarchic reorganization redefined the boundary between those who held the reins of the production process and those who were reduced to flexible labors. As it has been noted, this applies to the textile sector, but also to construction and the food industry. Secondly, this relationship with the political authorities was a decisive factor in the legitimacy and survival of these bodies. The transition from the communes to the regional states did not mark the end of the guilds, but their transformation into bodies serving the public good. The state delegated administrative, supply, and social control functions to the guilds, obtaining in return a labor market that could be monitored through centralized judicial bodies. Finally, the analysis of apprenticeship provided some clues regarding the gap between regulation and practice, the so-called apprenticeship paradox, namely the absence from formal rules in over 60% of cases and the low capacity for enforcing contracts in the courts, suggests that the guild did not act as a rigid cage. So the call is to pay greater attention, in the end, to the internal composition of the bodies, their capacity for action, and above all, the balances of power that were created both within and outside the guild institution.
Grazie, Andrea.
Thank you, Andrea, for this beautiful overview and for the rich presentation which has been provided. Without any possible comparison to any country whatsoever. Now let's switch to Portugal now. Two communications. The first by Luís Miguel Duarte from Porto University, who is going to speak of Portuguese corporations. So, in the Middle Ages. Good morning. I want to start with three major limitations. The first is research. This is the research before the second half of the 16th century. This data has been lost. We have no ledgers, no notarial books, we have no agreements, no apprenticeship contracts. For the documentation, urban documentation, we don't have any deeds about municipal deliberations, but just for the end of the 15th century. As to the ledgers, the accounting books, we have something concerning Porto. We don't have any accounting reports of a workshop or merchants. We have something as to shipbuilding for the 16th century. So problems of scale, the absence, once again, of census and general surveys, so avoids us to make some approximate calculations. So these are missing figures generally cited. In my view, they have no solid empirical grounding. With the total population between 1 million, 1.5 million inhabitants, Lisbon might have 30,000 inhabitants, Porto 10,000 inhabitants. Round figures. We didn't got big cities. We got small villages, quite small, but we know quite well the distribution of this population. These data also can be translated into the amount of artisans per craft and into the size of workshops of undertakings. Another element is the recent renewal of economic history, which didn't make it possible to get an idea of many features of the medieval Portuguese economy. Lands barren, surplus, problems, fisheries important, shipbuilding very strong. The impact of regional commerce or trade is not so well known. As to the international trade, this was limited by some obstacles. Companies were just, corporations were banned. We got some partnership, but no corporations, no guilds. Barters was also performed. Exports also represent some added value. Produce from farming, Algarve, wax, sugar, and many other commodities, lots of fish, above all for the reign of Valencia. Also, we have some values in all this, and also some guilds for leather, transports, also some free charges for freight. Also, we got some industrial business chains supporting exports. So coopers, pottery, but in Portugal, we didn't get the same of the Castile wool and the Dina del Campo fairs. So maritime trade was an important major source of revenue in Porto, in Lisbon, in Faro, and in other Portuguese towns. Let's look at some features of handicraft and the Portuguese industry. Some doubts after reading the core of the artisanship industry. I got the to take advantage of this information to consider all the papers written about this, because in Portugal, as you all know, we got the chance of reading the international historiography, and we wanted to confirm this as to our past, being mostly focused on our sources. For Cordoba and Navarro, so I'm just in countries totally foreigner to this. Also, we have Redmond work to be mentioned, a huge quantity of links between the 14th and 15th century. And in the same century, Portugal had just a founding state, but we had no regulation for crafts and trades being distinctive from others. That's the end of the 15th century. And also human bases also. We got many of this. Privileges also. So this was quite normal, but we didn't get real market guilds or corporations. In the 16th century, in Lisbon, Arnaldo was speaking of this kind of organization. I believe, above all, that's a matter of urban measures in order to make sure of the good running of life downtown. The rules of a local trade are very well determined as well. Well, so we have some worries, strong concerns, and towns so do not take care of the understanding or investigation of crafts and trades. This is open up to other scenarios. At the end of the 16th century, we have additional cases suggesting that we have some additional situation. A barber shop, I take this example, organizing his, craft, and has to pass an examination to be a barber, to open his barber shop. Let's go back to the same classical scheme now, which has been debated in 2009. Masters was a not very well-known designation in Portugal. The definition of masters was a bit blurred. Also for artisans, surgeons, that take an example after many. This was a bit blurred, not so crystal clear. We got this for masons, not for carpenters in a way. This was a special qualification, contractual and not hierarchical. Workers work in civil construction field. Also we got servants, dalits also. Very often we see also some, shop hands. That's an important point to raise. But how this name was used, the name of the craft, how was that used? It was difficult to do this in the 16th century. Just once, we see this quote in special circumstances. So a law, there is a law, a provision of law, thus keeping people in the countryside and not using these people as apprentices in trades and crafts. The big civil construction sites were very important, like in Porto. I speak of the royal palace, military constructions. We had a lot of progress for construction works. Also, the construction of some fortresses, stronghold, very impressive. The religious construction, monasteries, and also convents or nunneries, very important. Shipbuilding yards also, very important. The Casa de Macheras, blacksmiths, also very important. Located in Lisbon, they were just working for Morocco, blacksmiths. The same occurred in Porto. In the 16th century, many people left the town. They flee the town to settle in Andalusia or Algarve, thus transferring the manufacturing capabilities, being so wide, and then sheep building yards. So the rural craftsmanship is not very well known in Portugal, but the oil from Coimbra. But the most interesting sector is the one of Coimbra olive oil. That's a special production, high-quality production of olive oil, with some designation of origin, being totally protected designation of origin. Also, we got the owners of oil yards, orchards, cultivating and making olive oil. So people working in these orchard were very, very skilled, qualified, but also we got seasonal workers for picking up olives, those transporting the basket full of olives up to Coimbra for milling the olives. And also we have a second link with another sector, the millers, olive mills. So the lords, the lordship, wealthy people exploiting this kind of crop and also leasing the olive mills. We know quite well also the work carried out by these people. And thanks to this documentation, in the second half of the 16th century, there was a master of the mill, olive mill, with some workers, laborers, artisans. and the rules were very stringent for daily work. The meal, the hour of sleep also, and also working hours. All this was very well planned. I don't want to speak of olive trade, but the towns were very, very, very worried. They took care of a good olive transportation, of a good supply distribution. They were very much, so busy about this. I want also to make a summary of this manufacturing field, but so productive field. So also we have fruits being transported from Algarve to the Nordic European countries by sea. So hundreds of vessels, thousands of coops, of bags, of baskets being shipped to the Northern European countries, carrying this produce. One major factor is the presence of a nobility in trade and commerce. One of the most distinctive features of the medieval Portuguese history is just the weaknesses of nobility. So gentry versus Castile, France, and the UK, these economic and financial weaknesses has some detrimental disruptive effects in the Portuguese economy. In the 14th century, some noble men got ships in Porto and Lisbon, being just involved in international trade, and also in supplying services. So unloyal or unfair competition, the people representation said. This was just unfair because the noblemen have some incentives from the fiscal viewpoint. In the Douro Valley, also, they have just the status of citizens to export wine without paying levies or taxes. So the Silk House, as I said, with its photographs, some specialists coming from Burgos to inspect the quality of production. Well, this is the most, traditional part of this Portuguese condition, doing things. Many were owners, monopolies for the production of soap. Some doubts. How did they fund the handicraft industry? How was all that financed by these people? I don't want to read this out, but that's a problem of the entire Portuguese economy, fundraising. That's a big trouble. It's not very much clear. So towns also have some deficit, and so defaults. So merchants have the money, financial resources. So also the exchange was also ruled by the monarchy, by the king, by the crown of Portugal. Okay, in agreement with the Portuguese sources, but real estate, so land, houses, were just a major source of income for, the state treasury, and also with some link with some Jewish populations, trade association. And once again, we don't have one single solution. Many trades are put together just to come straight to some salary or wages list. But maybe all the rulers of the city have just to fix some complex of some litigation. So crafts must be represented at the municipal level, but very often not with a great success. As we read, one artisan can have some weight in the municipality, but this depends from one person to the other. And also everything is quite informal in artisanal craft association or art associations. We have some scale economies. Also localization can be also delineated according to the several crafts involved, thus give rise to some possible scenario. Can we talk of a class of group awareness? We have two different thoughts about this. As this applies to towns, also for crafts this time, this mostly depends on the very concentration of the artisans, craftsmen. It depends on the type of production, depends on the type of working flow. Speaking of Porto, the very wealthy bourgeois ruling the town in this very close century, so very conservative from the political viewpoint. So these people go straight to modernity with some delay, and they were scared of artisans. They thought they were too arrogant. They were scared of a possible revolt or uprising. This is making us think of Marxism. The class of artisans, that's a class that cannot be a freestanding class with some awareness, being capable of fighting, standing up for economic and social objectives to reach, common ones, to change things. Having not the gut of doing this. So undebatable, so with some agonism, which is also included in the political history of this country. The reaction is very violent sometimes, and swiftly. Of course, we know the major leverage has been the wealthy inhabitants of the city, and they took the power. I want to finish this off with a partial explanation of their capability of mobilization and intervention. So the military element, in a way. So the most, scary corps was Besteiros do Contro. So the bow archers, in a way. Because we got 40 for Porto, 200 for Lisbon, and so a very high number of people. So they are the archbow. So they're using these archbow, and they were to train all afternoons and Saturdays, and they fought in groups. They have to be married, but also they were obliged to be artisans in order to use the archbow, the crossbow. So never fisherman, never peasants, always a craftsman. We speak of the crossbowers. So they made use of their own hands. So these meetings, these battles didn't change anything, but this might be very useful. Thank you.
Grazie Luís Miguel per la relazione.
Thank you. Thank you for this overview on the country of Portugal. We continue on Portugal with Professor Arnaldo Sousa Melo from the University of Minho about the transition of models of professional associations from the 14th to the 16th century. Please. Thank you. So the beginning of my presentation is facilitated because I will continue on the topics of my colleague. So the first part of my presentation, as I was saying, would be about a continuation, in a way, of what Professor Duarte has been saying. So just to start, a very brief observation on the vocabulary issue. Well, actually, it's also a very neat distinction, as colleague Caracausi told us about Italy. We have a neat separation, a neat distinction, because on the one side, we have a history of differentiation, which started on the vocabulary used in the field about which we are talking about, and also on the historiographic vocabulary of the 16th century, which is not always the same thing. Although the words are the same, the meaning is not always the same. So this is to say that on the designation of corporation or guild, we can find very different definitions. So we should, carry out a reflection on the thing, on the issue, whether we have the risk of defining different realities with the same words. But this is very interesting indeed. It's very interesting also what Andrea has just said, has just told us about Italy. But this is very different because there's no similarity with the Portuguese reality of the Middle Ages, but also of the modern era. So, well, maybe it's not the right moment now, but I would like to tell more about designations and about vocabulary of words used for this phenomenon. Maybe this is not the right occasion, but again, as I was saying, this kind of cooperation did not exist according to what has been said about Italy. So very briefly. So, starting from the presentation of my colleague, Professor Duarte, until the mid-15th century, but 14th and 16th century, the trades in Portugal, even though they did not have formal structures, formal organizations of trades, they demonstrated a capacity of organization, yes, of creating structures, and also to create activities with this capacity also of political contestation. Even though we did not have a formal organization, well, the trades showed in practice of having a common activity to defend their interests. So this is very important, both in the 14th and in 15th centuries. It was very strong in Portugal, as Professor Duarte showed us. So then things changed towards the end of 15th century, and above all, starting from the 16th century. So what can we say? We can say that in the 15th century, the inconsistent model of a trade association predominated. So we had a fragmentation, a high fragmentation of the trades coming from the public authorities, like the municipal authorities, and often there was a coordination with consultants. But from a juridical point of view, it was mainly public authorities and specifically municipal authorities which issued ordinances on trades activities. And this characteristic, this is a hallmark we need to take into consideration, because this kind of regulations on the trades starting from the 16th century, they are always municipal issued regulations. There are no different kinds of regulations. But the corporations, the guilds, have always a local character of a specific city. So for this kind of ordinances, let's see. Yes, I'm going on with my slides. So this kind of regulation by municipal authorities, again, they are issued by municipal authorities. So here we are in the 14th and 15th centuries. So we have said the main concern was to make these regulations about the access to the trade. So in Portugal, the first corporations set up in the end of 14th century were a lot about the access to the trade, but also before that, without a municipal authority, well, you needed the municipal authority in any case. And the main concern was to control a certain number of trades, of activities, of businesses, so a certain number of persons per trade. So this is a control on a municipal level on the access to the specific trades. So this approach also influenced the apprenticeships, the wages. All these regulations are to be found in Portugal in particular in municipal ordinances, but which were often issued as mandatory. So it was necessary to find an agreement with the people belonging to the trade, but also with the authorities, which had the power to decide upon upon the regulations. So parallel to this, there were a series of habits typical to each trade and typical to each city. So we know because it is documented in archives. So we had oral habits. We do not know specifically, or we know only a few about them, but these have to be taken into consideration. Again, there's a whole series of documentation, the whole documentation from the municipal authorities. Then we also had controlling activity by the people, the people who belong to the trades, not only from the public authorities. So again, the municipal authorities controlled the trades, especially trades in the seigneury. So I tried to reply to two main questions. The first is why this model before the end of the 15th century, why this model, this kind of organizational model, obstacled the setup of the corporations. So to answer this question, well, it is first of all important to pose this question, and the second question is why the model of professional corporations develops starting from the 15th and 16th century, and above all, specifically in certain cities. So we talk about cooperative organizations. And as we have said, until the end of 15th century, we did not have this kind of organization. Then starting from 15th and 16th century, in some cities, we can observe the setting up of this kind of corporations. But just stepping back to what I have been saying about vocabulary. So to use the term corporation, we mean by using this word is to talk about professional activities, professional commercial activities. So in Portugal, at least until 15th and 16th century, as I was saying, the relationship between merchants, between traders, did not exist. So you had the different businesses, the different trades. So this is the base. This is the basis. So on this, in consideration of this, I will try to reply to these two questions. So concerning the first one, we will said, why did this kind of organization did not exist until the 15th century? Well, we need to reflect on the kind of society of those times. So, and many Portuguese people from the 15th and 16th century, from a sociological point of view, they divided the Portuguese society between noblemen and clergy, and then it is subdivided in major and minor groups. So this difference between major and minor, well, it's not actually a juridical subdivision, but rather it is a sociological subdivision, using these words, the words we can find in the documents of those times, in the deeds of those times. So there we can find definitions about merchants and traders or rural owners and officials among the people of the trades. So the members, they belong to the trade and to the city. So these are specialists, are experts. And the minors are the independent traders, so all other professionals. And this is an important distinction, because this implies social and political consequences, since traders, of course, do not belong to the local government. Well, they tried to be part of it, as Professor Duarte was saying, at the end of the 14th century in many Portuguese cities, but so they tried actually to gain political power in the local government authorities, but the oligarchy of power, of urban power, always tried to avoid the sharing, the power sharing. They tried to avoid sharing power with traders, with members of trades. So they had some representatives in the city councils, but with a very limited power, which was actually reduced in 15th century. So from an individual point of view, as we have said, the trade members, they succeeded in becoming part of the urban oligarchy, and then they got different designations, but these are rather individual professionals rather than groups and trades. So this is also an important difference. So the associations had the possibility to develop a certain organizational structures. We also had brotherhoods of trades, trade associations. They were mainly, they had a religious character, and they were offering also assistance. So these are not actually professional trades, professional associations. These are actually quite rare. But before the mid-15th century, they were rare, especially before that period. But we do have examples of brotherhoods being a relationship, having a relationship with religion and assistance. So there you have they contributed to the development of trade associations. So again, as I was saying, by mid-15th century, these brotherhoods developed with these characteristics. So there is direct relationship between these confraternities, brotherhoods, and trade associations and trades. And with what will then be the professional organizations. So corporations, guilds, did not actually start from brotherhoods. So, on the contrary, this was quite rare. So, why the model of professional corporations develops starting from the 16th century? So we have the emergence of the statutes of the trades in that period. So what can we say about it, about this particular period? Well, there we also have the emergence of these regulations about trades. We do not have a real statutes until 16th, 17th century. We find the first examples starting from the end of the 15th centuries. Before that, there were no statutes, no real statutes of professional corporations. Only after that, we find in the documentation real statutes. So in the correspondence of the setting up of a new trade, you have the relative statute. So the existence of a professional corporation was a new thing in Portugal in that period. So it implied the existence of also official statutes. And I will go more into detail on this. So as I was saying, before that period, before mid-15th century, we did not have real professional corporations, real trades. We have, like, authorizations from the municipal authorities. But there was, a set of rules which were issued about specific businesses. It was not, as I was saying, they were not real statutes. This is something we can observe in Lisbon, for example. I will show some details on this later. We have some activities like proposing this kind of statutes first, so before others. And again, the public authorities are the only ones who can authorize this and confirm this. But the last word is given from the king, by the king. But again, the authorizations, the regulations are issued by the municipal authorities, by the public authorities. The trade, the people from the trade, they propose some regulations, but the last word again is by the king. So the trades are proposing to the municipality, and then the municipality decides whether to approve it, to authorize it or not. So on this slide, I will try to be very brief. So we have some examples of published deeds. These examples show the existence of this kind of regulations. So here you can find the first examples of laws. As I was saying, they are not real statutes or charters. The very first example you see of this table you have also the content of the regulations about tanners in this case in particular. These are considered in historiography the very first statutes in Portugal. Here we are in 1400, early 1500, so quite late with respect to other countries. So here you can see that these were people from the trade who organized themselves in this kind of brotherhood, of confraternity, and for the very first time they set up this set of rules and regulations, which are the main elements defining these regulations beyond technical issues. Well, the main issue is about the access to the trade, to the profession. So here you have the judges, trade judges, and here you find for the first time the obligation, to undergo an examination to be able to exercise the profession, the business. So, and there you have the judges, for example, for the shoemaker, for the shoemaker's trade. So anyone who wanted to become a shoemaker in Lisbon, for example, they had to undergo an examination with or without an apprenticeship period. And so there you had a whole series of regulations again for different kind of trades, and here we have again the first real examples of the early forms of statutes. So this is the main novelty. So which were the people authorized to exercise a profession in Lisbon? These documents defined, these regulations defined who were allowed to do a certain job, a certain work, and who wasn't. So anyone who wanted to enter a business, they had to undergo an examination, because for all these trades, this was a very important step. Because if we have a regulation for the trade, there you state who is allowed to be part of the trade. This is a very practical aspect. So this is the very first, the early creation of the trades. So here you have the definition of who could enter a trade. So you had to, here it was defined how to register in a trade. So to conclude, I would like to point on this transition. In 1481, the representatives of the people, so the urban delegates, so this kind of a figure did not exist, actually, because they start to exist in 1489. But in 1401, the representatives of the people, they asked the king to pose conditions to exercise a business, to exercise a trade, to carry out a trade. So this was the request, to define the conditions on the basis of which one could exercise a business or not, one was allowed to be part of a trade or not. So there was a group of specialists So in Lisbon, there was an oligarchy. So in Portugal, there in this period, an oligarchy started, practically. So this defined the way and the conditions to be part of a trade. Then this was spread to other cities, so it was quite a novelty for Portugal, again, which took place between the end of the 15th and the start of the 16th century. Thank you. Thank you for this overview about the transformation of the corporations, about the trade organizations in Portugal. Now we're doing a short coffee break. And I would like to remind you that for the following discussion, anyone can participate. Please fill the form, fill this form. This is available for you here. Just fill it. So see you later. Enjoy your
No, noi riprendiamo i lavori di...
Okay, so we are just coming back from our coffee break, and now we start the Q&A session. We're going to collect all the questions. The speakers, you will take in notes of these questions, and then you will be given the floor to answer these questions. Okay, let's begin with the first speaker, Professor from Ankara, Maria Fusaro, shares a question for you.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed all presentations this morning, and I have a specific question about the paper you gave. I really like this proposal of the functional approach. Part of me still thinks, and in fact, in a view from the outside, because I've never dealt with these things, it strikes me more and more that possibly the only European uniqueness is precisely in urban political self-governance in various degrees. However, what I would like to know a bit more about is this GDIC system. What exactly it entails in terms of becoming a desirable item, element in the secondary market, in a sort of financialization of these things, and how is it connected with the sort of 18th century internal reforms of the economic sector within the Ottoman Empire, and how does it apply? Is it something that works only in specific areas, or can we see different embodiment of the GDIC system, let's say, between the Balkans and Anatolia, just to name one?
Good question.
Thank you very much.
Grazie. Grazie.
Thank you. Minimet Orka.
Hello, and thank you for your presentation. I'm from Turkey, so I'm also here for a workshop. I will also present a paper in the workshop, like in later days. So I know the topic, but in my paper I deal with earlier periods, and I want to learn. I want to know if you also have this system as a continuous progress from Futuwa organizations and Aki brotherhoods and then GDIC system, or do you think that GDIC system is a different thing, like corporations in Portugal, in professor's presentation? So do you think that those are continuous or separate? Something about solidarity at one side, earlier times, and something more corporatist in the later, in GDICs? And my second question, do you think any relationship between the military aspect, like the Janissaries, and that youth organizations? Because in my research, I might have found some implications between that Aki brotherhoods and Janissaries. There are some implications, not real material things. So this is the question. Do you...
Is this impressionistic or based on a documentation, like a complete archival stuff? Because this whole business of Ahi brotherhood, I think in certain ways it's mythical.
Yes, il microfono.
Okay. But anyway, and how about, this point you asked about youth organizations, what are you referring to?
Yeah, like in Islamic guild literature, they usually start with that Futuwa Nama or Futuwet Name in Ottoman. And Futuwa is the youth organization or young manliness organizations in broader Islamic context. So do you see any continuity in that?
Okay.
This is the question. Thank you.
Grazie. Julie Christie.
Oui, bonjour à tous et merci pour ces
Good morning, anyone, and thank you for this wonderful presentation. So my question is a curiosity as a Middle East expert or a Middle Ages expert. We have some continuity elements under the Ottoman Corporation in Istanbul and the Byzantine Guild, very well known in the old texts. Is there any kind of continuity? So my question is, we have some continuity elements in the amount also of the communities, in the amount of activities. Which kind of activities were they, these activities? Being affected by the rules of the guilds you just listed for Istanbul. Is there any kind of continuity? Can you focus on the amount of these guilds in Istanbul, Turkey? Thank you.
Grazie. Jakov.
Okay, congratulations to all for very interesting presentations. My question is for Professor Yildirim, obviously. Maria already sort of pre-communicated and stole my question, as always. I would like to continue a bit along what she already asked, and that is, I guess, about the embeddedness of these organizations you were talking about. I too like the sort of functional approach you're taking, trying to figure out, well, how they organize rather than using these sort of, well, broad labels as that there is no corporation in Islamic society, etc. But I was also intrigued by these yediks, which sound to me like contracts. Which then suggests that these professional organizations were somehow connected to law. And this brings me to the question, if you look at the European corporation, it is very much embedded in law. This is the main point, right? This is, well, as Maria indicated, widely believed to be quite unique. On the other hand, there is Timur Koran, for instance, claiming that the only way to organize anything like this would be through the Waqf. You did not mention the Waqf, which to me suggests that there might have been a different way to embed these organizations in law. Is this true, and which way would that then be? Thank you.
Jacob. Per Andrea.
I can immediately continue. Okay. Thanks, Andrea. I really liked what you did. I liked the quantitative approach. One thing that intrigued me, and this is a question of complete ignorance, of course, as well, those of you who know me, well, you are aware of this. What struck me was the number of guilds per person increasing over time. And if you connect this to one of your main conclusions, namely that guilds respond to political structures, I was just wondering, could you elaborate a bit more on that? Is this a matter of urban governments over-regulating and as a result craftsmen organizing more? Or is this more a traditional capital versus labor sort of thing where there is a risk that wealthy craftsmen or merchants become too powerful, and this leads to, in a sort of classical Marxist sense, the organization of an increasing number of people in craft guilds and craft guild structures? Thank you.
Grazie. Dalla transizione a Andrea.
Thank you for the question to Andrea. We have a lot of questions to Andrea Caracausi. Sabatini.
Sì, io ho molto apprezzato.
I really appreciate all these communications, all these papers, also the ones I'm not saying anything about. And above all, so to my friend Caracausi, how to say, I just want to ask these questions. I want to urge him to do more. He said, justly said, so he did an incredible work, also coming back to some previous activities I took part in as well in my past career. And so he said, he stated that in Venice and in Milan, there is no political role of guilds of corporation. This is not the case. So in a way or in another, I'm a specialist from Lucca from this viewpoint. And in Lucca, in Tuscany, we have no official political role of guilds of corporations. But apart from, the official feature of this, above all, in a microscopic scenario versus Milan and Venice, so we have a sort of co-penetration, total co-penetration. So the same manager, the same directors, and above all, the art of merchants being at the same time the leaders of this cooperation and the leaders of the republic. The merchants being the rulers, the leaders of the republic. So that's a very interesting blend of mixtures. A few years ago, I wrote just a book, the uprising of the rag sellers or beggars. So there is a sort of renunciation, a sort of doubling of these great merchants. Their political feature, being merchants, rulers of the republic, and their craft being the silk entrepreneurs. They will make the choice of being more politicians and not merchants. They will give up to the modernization of work within guilds, but they will make their choice to be politicians, not merchants. But the issue of the weight of cooperation of guilds inside these, the state of the townscape, maybe this has to be understood with additional nuances in a way. So can you please elaborate on this point, Andrea? Could you, please? Thank you. Mathilde Marot. Thank you. I'm asking Andrea, but this question has been also interesting for other presenters. I aim your type, local crafts, whatsoever, and so master craft or special crafts. So my question, I says the corporations in this type of types, how they can remain at the core, or how they can go outside, being core or just, outside guilds, So the work of guilds is the one of having the largest production scale, just going beyond the limits you set up already in your speech. How is it possible to move from the center to the middle, from the core to the, to the periphery of this diagram? Thank you.
Ricardo Córdoba.
Ricardo Córdoba.
Oui, bonjour à tous et congratulations for...
Morning, congratulations. I want to raise some more reflection for Caracausi and also for the Portuguese colleagues, for Arnaldo. So the apprenticeship. So we know, so according to some ages, we know we have some difference between one age bracket and the other. We speak of the apprenticeship contract. The duration of this contract depends, 2 or 3 years. But for Castile, and I think also for the Iberian Peninsula, for the Aragon crown at least, we have some differences between the indication of ordinances, of statutes, and the reality itself. This can be checked thanks to the notarial contracts. 2 apprenticeship contracts, we can see that the older people have just longer stay within the guild with a better remuneration versus the younger members of the guilds. So the young people have just to learn the job, to remain just within this guild. So also in Italy and in Porto, is it possible to see this situation in more detail? It's going to be possible. So the different classifications according to ordinances and notarial deeds.
Franco Franceschi.
Grazie Andrea per questa.
Thank you, Andrea, for this brilliant presentation. Very interesting. And also the efforts you accomplished to define some types of typologies, which is good for the very first day of our meeting in Prato. So the question is a bit marginal question. So vis-a-vis many things you said, but towards the end of your presentation, you said of some guilds being controlled more strongly by the power, the ruling power, communal power, or whatever this might be, or municipal or seigneurial power, lordship. That's the matter. So that's a topic which is frequently tackled because we have a lot of people, medievalists, have been studying this so far. Also, they found some previous roots in this approach, the Roman Empire, the Byzantium world. But what really struck me, and I want to get your opinion about this, so this is not coming to an end shortly towards the end of the Middle Ages, but this continues even beyond the Middle Ages period. There's a classical case, so the grocery crafts, foodstuff crafts, but also you also mentioned the paper craft, paper-making craft. Sabatini is with us in this room, being a specialist, but so at random these days I was reading something on this, and I was asking myself, what's your opinion? So I would like to know the motivations for this. Also in this sector, we go straight to some regulation. Before the 16th century, we didn't get big corporations in Italy, at least, in the field of paper making, paper mills. I want to know if this motivation can be considered along the motivation for which we do something in the grocery, transportation fields, also in the building sector as well. Thank you. Posso
Un attimo, si rieccomoda.
Please hold. 1 second. 1 second, please. Thank you.
Sì, devo anch'io ritornare.
I have to come back to this complex presentation of Caracausi, Andrea. Two different parts. We have the introduction, and then we have a very, very deep analysis. For this second part, I have to think of this. Too many upstream problems. For the first part, okay, so some clarifications already said by Jacopo above all. What was, at the very end, this reduction of inhabitants versus guild? Which mechanisms can be considered behind this? I might say something very generic and trivial. Maybe capitalism of economic efficiency. So out of the blue, these inhabitants being reduced in amount vis-a-vis the amount of entrepreneurs. So that's a sort of quite weird, complex historical mechanism, which finally is paving the way to the elimination or the death of corporation guilds. These trade associations will die, so for a higher economic logics behind. So we have a lot of stuff to think of. Andrea is going to tell us something more as to this point raised by me. Thank you. Onur, please go ahead, Onur.
ONUR. Okay?
Scusi.
That's okay. I'm actually struck by your point with regards to the state's use of the guilds as instruments for social control, health policing, food supply, and labor control. I mean, this is interesting. So this is like that the state defines these roles for the guilds, or the guilds already providing these functions, and then states sort of finds it convenient and adopts a sort of somewhat an indifferent role and just accepts it as it is and then moves on. So is it the state or the guild that initiates?
Grazie. Luís Miguel. Luís Miguel. Para Arnaldo.
Il m'a raisonnablement payé pour lui poser cette question.
Micro.
Non, je disais que mon ami m'a bien payé pour que je vais essayer de lire la question comme il.
I'm going to answer this question now. So, as the corporations at the 16th century, see, the crown is very rich. The crown is very rich. So the town policy is over now. In Porto, the advent of Christians from Castile is very important, just taking in hands the power of the towns. And the hierarchical structure is for charity foundations. That's one of the main elements. It's not a real question. It's a general event or phenomenon.
L'aider portugaise.
Mais je peux poser mes deux questions dans.
I have two questions. I'm going to start with Luís. Thank you very much for your presentation. You just said shortly the role of women. So very quickly, I would like to have more details on the presence of women in craftsmanship world. And the second question, which is very important to me, you also said the importance of farming activities, processing activities, produce converting processes, and the olive mill in Coimbra. Do you see the presence of any women in these olive mills or converting mills? So I wanted to know something about the presence of women, because usually these sometimes also outside Portugal, these structures, these facilities were on a regular basis run by women. Do you have some Portuguese documents for the other colleague, Arnaldo Melo? I've got the feeling that at the end of the 15th century, guilds, so they appear shortly in the Portuguese documentation. But with all skills which can be observed elsewhere in other towns like Bari. So I think that certainly at the end of the 15th century, after the tables are being shown on your slides, they just show up quickly with all necessary skills and competencies. So my question is this one. I understood the difference between the timely rules, municipal rules, and in spite of all this, can we know if we have some additional models which at a certain time, coming from the side, don't know anything about this, are going to help these guilds in order to be more formalized? Brutally, shortly, I got the feeling that we have some internal demand of the craftsmanship milieu looking for external models to adopt in their crafts. Thank you. Okay, it's up to you now, please.
Can I start? Okay, I think it works. Now it works better. Okay, first about this Gedik business. I mean, this is how to start? You know, this Gedik thing, it's you don't see it in the 16th, 17th centuries. It's sort of a mid-18th century institutional innovation on the part of the guilds. I mean, with a few guilds in the beginning, but then all the guilds somehow resort to Gedik. So they start, I mean, the guild masters begin to sort of register their shops and their status with the state, and then they get the certificate. So it's sort of, in the certificate they have the rights neatly confirmed: right to use the space. This is the first thing. Right to use the workshop where they practice their craft, and those spaces were traditionally owned by the Wakf, the pious foundations. But now this is sort of almost like a step toward detaching these properties from the ownership of the Wakf and making them sort of private assets, private properties. And then also the fixed capital, whatever instruments there were within the workshop were also registered in the name of the masters. So this is almost like confirming, in a way strengthening the barrier to entry, because the guild masters first wanted to sort of prevent the outsiders from entering their crafts. That's one thing. And then the second thing, they want to sort of, you know, prevent the apprentices and the others within the workshop from claiming rights to mastership. So this is sort of a complicating thing, and a complicated instrument. It evolves into a financial asset. It evolves into a financial sort of a paper in the course of time, especially in the 19th century. It begins as a sort of a defensive weapon in the hands of the masters, but then gradually, as the masters begin to die and as they sort of go bankrupt, their Gedik certificates began to circulate in the market, and they are fragmented. There are sort of multiple shares to a single Gedik. And stuff. So this is sort of an 18th century and mostly 19th century story, and it creates a lot of confusion and complexity in the market. So the state takes a step to sort of abolish them all during the reform era in the mid-19th century, but it fails to do so. And what it does, what the Gedik does, we argue, actually we have two articles, one published in Economic History Review by a student of mine, and then another published in a book on Ottoman economic history, myself and this student of mine together. So we discussed the whole evolutionary process from the beginning to the end. It sort of helps capture this dynamism that the guilds showed, especially the masters actually demonstrated in these difficult times, because late 18th century and early 19th century is the time when you begin to see the Ottoman guilds being significantly and seriously challenged by European merchants, by European trade. And this is the era during which the Ottoman markets are somehow invaded by goods coming from Europe. So the larger version of my paper actually has a discussion of Gedik, like 2-3 pages. Summarizing what we did in our published articles, and also adding a few new findings. I could talk for hours on Gedik, so I don't want to do this. But I do have, I mean, in the essay that you're going to be reading, I think you'll find it extremely interesting, because the intentions that the masters had in the beginning, those intentions actually backfired in the long run. And somehow contributed to the dissolution and disintegration of the guilds. If anything, it sort of helped the disintegration of the spatial unity and uniformity that the guilds represented. This continuity thing, I mean, right before my colleague actually finished, Arnaldo finished his speech, I said, look, there is so much continuity, so much similarity, commonality in between the Portuguese and the Ottoman guilds. I mean, this whole discussion about the confraternity background, this brotherhood background thing, and and all the rest. We do have a similar discussion, but again, it's sort of a without a concrete documentation and analysis based exclusively on impressionistic evidence. I'm going to actually stick to this point, and I will say yes. I mean, there is definitely some sort of a continuity through this Futuva tradition and the whole business of brotherhoods gradually evolving into guilds. But this is something we can only say based on impressionistic evidence. There is really no concrete documentation. So, I mean, there are a few dissertations I know, but I find them not well grounded and not well founded in terms of their empirical backgrounds. One thing that I can say about the Futuva, I mean, in almost all the guilds, when it comes to rituals and ceremonies, there is definitely a sort of a tone of Futuva, those ethical and moral, values associated with Futuva being respected by the guild members and being used so as to sort of, promote solidarity within the. I agree with that, but even that is not, some kind of a, robustly, neatly documented issue. I mean, I wrote about it a little bit. But in the article that I'm going to be contributing to the volume, I do have a discussion of that as well, and where I sort of show my, doubts and some of the questions that I have been asking all along. And with regards to the generosity factor, the same thing. As for this Byzantine-Ottoman continuity, I like the question, and I have been asking the same question all along, whether or not the Byzantine syntechnia in various Byzantine cities, in Thessaloniki, in Istanbul, in the other parts of the Balkans and Anatolia, somehow continued well into the Ottoman times and sort of evolved into the kind of guilds that we know. Very difficult to say, but it is one. I think it's one of the legitimate questions to ask, because after all, the guilds did not come out of the blue. They must have had some kind of a background, some kind of a origin. But when it comes to, again, documentation as to what extent the Byzantine syntechnia, the Byzantine guilds, got transformed into Ottoman guilds. I mean, impressionistically, you can say a couple things, but I mean, archival document-wise, I don't think there is anything significant. Many years ago, there was one Byzantine specialist, Spiros Vidionis, wrote back in 1972 an article claiming that the Byzantine guilds must have had some imprints and impact on the Ottoman guilds, but it was again very much based on impressionistic evidence. There was really no direct, empirical evidence to what he said. This is a project I formulated recently, and hopefully in August I'll be actually conducting some sort of research at Princeton, where I studied. For 1 month, and this is exclusively on Byzantine-Ottoman economic continuity. Okay, so the guilds are part of the system, part of the agenda. As for the what was the last question? Embeddedness of these organizations. I don't know what you meant by.
Distribution across the empire.
Okay, so look, one of the things I'm really interested, and I also wanted to sort of hear what you people the European scholars are doing as to when the guilds began. Okay? I mean, when do we start seeing them emerging from silhouettes into concrete realities? Okay, and this is one question. So I was very curious as to what the situation was in Portugal and what the situation was in Italy. And to be honest with you, I don't have a sort of a very satisfying answer. I mean, I see some tentative answers, and it applies the same way to the Ottoman case. So in the Ottoman case, you go to Istanbul in the 16th century. I mean, you may find guilds, but you go to Cairo after the conquest, you're not going to find any guilds. Okay, and then in the 17th century, you're going to go to Cairo and you're going to find guilds. Okay, and you know or you're going to go to another Ottoman city. You're going to go to Baghdad or Aleppo or to Damascus or Jerusalem. For example, in Jerusalem in the 16th century, one scholar mapped out the entire guild system and said everything is in the hands of the guilds. Okay, so it's not even. So it's not like that the state, or it's not like that the guildsmen or the artisans and craftsmen make a decision at some point in time and say that tomorrow morning all of us will organize ourselves into that sort of a. It doesn't work that way. I mean, it is, I think, sort of this whole business of guild creating or guild building is a spontaneous work in progress type of thing that happens. So you may find certain craftsmen being organized in the same sector in Istanbul or in Bursa, but you may find these people not organized in a guild elsewhere. Okay, so there's not some kind of a synchronicity. There's not some kind of a, uniformity in the way the guilds were organized. One thing that I'm going to say, I mean, this business about the state-guild relationship, something that I think one of the common themes here, and our colleagues addressed this. In the case of the Ottoman Empire, I mean, it's very difficult to make a very strong case so as to say that the state, from the very beginning, used the guilds as somehow instruments, so as to control the market and so as to run its economic. I mean, there were times when you find the state and the guild acting in a very sort of harmonious and cooperative way, and there are times when you find them at odds with one another. Okay, so in the 18th century, for example, when the state begins to see the challenges posed by the European trade, I mean, it starts somehow searing its ties with some of the guilds and strengthens some of its ties with some of the other guilds. So it doesn't adopt a sort of a uniform approach to the guilds. In the late 18th century, you find, for example, the bakers being strictly, rigidly protected by the state, the same way the butchers and the tanners, but then you find the silk thread spinners being completely disregarded, completely ignored, and left to the mercy of the market by the state. The reason why I'm saying this, one thing that is constant, I think, in the Ottoman case, that the state plays a significant role in terms of procuring and distributing the raw materials to the guilds. So the guilds do not go to the market and freely purchase their raw materials. So the state has that sort of a organizing role, and it sort of because it's an empire we're talking about. It's not a tiny little city like Porto. It's not a tiny little city like Venice I mean, we're talking about an empire that stretches over like 3 continents. Okay, with so many big cities. Okay, so it's very difficult to organize the entire, the supply chains of all these raw materials. You have stuff coming from Ukraine, you have stuff coming from Africa, you have stuff coming from Anatolia and other places. So there is, I think, sort of a significant, logic and calculation as to how state distributes what it and how it calculates every single resource, and then considers the needs of demands of artisans in Aleppo and the demands of artisans in Sofia, right? So there is that. I think that in that sense, the Ottoman case is I mean, there's some uniqueness that one has to highlight, but there are also a lot of commonalities when you start scratching the surface and see the internal dynamics as to how things work.
Grazie.
Thank you.
Allora, grazie veramente.
Thank you, really. Thank you to everybody for your observations, the request for further details. I will try to be quite slow also for the translators so that you won't miss anything. So, according to question from Ako and Salvatore about the presence and formation of the corporations on the basis of the number of inhabitants, well, here we have several reasons. The first of which is clearer. Maybe I can specify it better in my paper. Well, it depends on the sample. Well, I will go on this later. Let's say that the center, the surveyed centers are those having more than 10,000 inhabitants. So where we have in between 15th, 16th century, we have the rising and increase of one guild every 1,600 inhabitants to one guild each 1,800. Well, we have the increase. So in 1700, we have a further increase. This is due to what? Well, two elements mainly. The first is bound to political decisions and government issues, and I will go deeper on this, on the use of the corporations by the state. So political choices to use trades and also their presence in strategic sectors, but most of all, it's because of the increasing professionalism in certain trades, textile and food industry in particular, where we have a very high rise in these numbers per inhabitant. So just to see some details, yes, we see this strong trend, and I will go more in depth on this further on. So as for the other question, well, first of all, I would like to thank everybody who contributed in the collection of data published in 2004, which is a very useful data as starting base. So thank you for asking for some more details on this. I will be in contact. I'm already in contact, but will be also in the future with the colleagues on this. So on this question about the officiality, but also the compenetration between corporations and government bodies, well, I agree. Actually, this I also wrote about this on the case of Verona, which is very interesting from this viewpoint, especially. But I think what's really evident is that we have a minor or major presence of some corporations more than others. This is depending also from their capacity of having access to those government bodies. So there is different kinds, different levels of influence also with respect to other corporations which do not have access to government bodies. So, and these corporations use more the public authorities to, influence the quality of products, the definition of the corporations, of the businesses. And then there is another element, starting from the case of Lucca, which has been analyzed, which is valid for many other cases, which is we have corporative organizations. So we do have some kind of corporation. So this is fundamental. This is crucial to understand, because even where you do not have guilds, real guilds, you do have, in any case, some kind of corporative organization. So, and now I go back to the question of Mature, concerning the corporations which kind of overlap with other businesses. Well, I agree with this. I actually limited my observations on some cases of apprenticeship, but we can also look at the conflicts about quality of products, about types of trade, type of businesses. So there are a lot of conflicts. You have trades in conflict with the competencies of other trades. We have haberdashers, textile professionals, but the problem comes out at the end of the 1500, start of 1600, with the huge wave of the corporation forming, where in some of these trades, food industry, textile industry, where you have a rise in the consumption, coffee, tea, or chocolate, for example. Also, new issues about the quality of the products starts to be important and crucial. So people started to discuss about product quality until several conflicts, as I was saying, among the trades, among the corporations broke out, which were quite daily. So starting from within the corporations themselves and to the context of the umbrella corporations. So we have different layers also of these conflicts. Another important topic is that of origin. So we will talk about it more in detail in the next days. So the state tried more than once, to group several trades on the basis of their mobility on the territory to use it as a tool, a control tool over the territory itself. So concerning the questions of by Ricardo Cordoba on apprenticeship and the different designations for the different contracts, well, actually, I did not want to make a paper on apprenticeship, but to take apprenticeship as one example, one possible field where to observe the different composition of the trades of the corporations, to observe the differences on several aspects. So I will not focus on all the aspects, but of course, yes, I agree. We have a duration which is lower than what's foreseen by the statutes, what's provided for by the statutes. So concerning the age of the apprentices, where sometimes exactly in these cases of exchange of apprentices, in the case of Venice, as was mentioned, and also in cases of corporations which do not regulate the presence of the apprentices. So beyond the different sectors, we could observe the types of corporations having this behavior or habits. The following questions about the corporations and the control on these corporations by the public power, well, this continues until the modern era, of course. So the question is about the reasons. Well, also in this case, we have two possible interpretations. The first is the strategic role of an asset like paper, where with increase of public bodies, administrative bodies between 16 and 1700 is, of course, crucial. But on the other hand, this kind of production is outside the town territory, urban territory. So there's a kind of link with the rural territory. And in this case as well, the presence of a state control, of a control from the state, is, of course, another important element to be borne in mind. Of course, paper later on, with the development of print, becomes an even more central topic. And then now coming on the last topic, on the last question, if the state admits explicitly to control the guilds, well, here I will start from a general consideration to end up in a very specific case. And I'm saying it clearly. Well, the state not always explicitly admits to use the corporations, but what emerges from the conflicts linked to the taxation, the direct taxation or indirect taxation, the state shows evidently that in 16th and 17th century to use corporations is the best choice. Also in cases in which you get less money than what you could collect. From the 17th century, with the broader organization for the collection of money, well, then the role of corporations changes, because this was one of their roles. They collected money on the territory because they had a right. They were allowed to visit the workshop and to check and control what there was or there wasn't. So that said, a particular case I have that struck me, the colleague Francesco Vianello, which I would like to remember here, concerns Venice in the end of 17th century. So where in many other situations you start to use the cadastral data to survey the territory, the Venetian Republic chooses this way of surveying the population, and also the officials in the first survey, they say the best way to know who exercises a business or another is to go to the corporations and ask them, because we do not have any authority which could better reply to this. So this is a late data, so to say, but it shows how aware they were of the role they had to understand who carried out what business. So I acknowledge that when you try to synthesize, to sum up, or to highlight some aspects rather than others, we can lose many elements, you can miss many elements. So thank you all, colleagues, for your details, and let's hear about the other contributions. Thank you.
D'abord, pour Ricardo.
So, let's start from Ricardo, from your... Where are you? I can't see you. Oh, here you are. Fine. So, well, actually, we do not have apprenticeship in medieval documentation, but I remember in medieval literature. But, well, Portuguese is a bit nasty with documentation, Also, a colleague was saying, that the quality of history depends not only directly from the sources. That's clear. That's clear. But it's a real pity, actually, because the documentation we found, of course, depends from the people who worked on that. So the artisans, the workers who worked on that. We found something on the proceedings and deeds concerning orphans. So we found documents about how to educate orphans. That's legacy, of course. So we found a lot of information, a lot of information on this. We also found data about children killed by somebody they worked for. So we can deduct from this also important information about this apprenticeship. For example, farmers' children could not move and go work in a workshop, for example. That's a general rule of what happened all over Europe, actually. So that occurred also during the Great Plague, and also in Portugal. The most deaths, we had a lot of deaths during the Great Plague in Portugal as well, of course. The question of Julie, well, that's quite difficult. I would like to thank you for this question. It's a difficult topic. I'm afraid of, dealing with this topic because, in Portugal, the history of men and women is often mixed up. And we often do not deal with the history of women. We will know something about it when we will know more about the everyday life of households and families. Concerning the oil production, there are regulations saying that only the master can sleep in the house where the oil mill is, so not all of its family. So we deduct that women participated not a lot in oil production and also in oil trade, oil commercialization. So that's reading the documentations of the back on 16th century. We have also information about bakers. And you have cases where you have men declaring themselves responsible of the mill, and they ask the city, the municipal authority, to use the mill for the grains. And there I have found 2 cases of women presenting themselves, going directly to the municipality, saying they are bakers, and they ask for the permission to buy the grain. And there's one of these 2 cases is a very young woman. I think it's a very rare case in Portugal. I don't know so much more about this. I'm sorry. Thank you. So about the issue of the issue of apprenticeship. Well, as Professor Duarte was saying before, we have some notary sources only starting from the 16th century. So this is to say that in general we do not have contracts of apprenticeship available. We have some statutes, some charters of specific years, but so one thing is to have the statutes, another thing is to have the contracts. We do not have the contracts. I remember this conference back in the 80s, where we were asked on what we worked on. Well, actually, we worked on the statutes. Now we have seen that after having worked on the statutes, we see that we have to work on the documents, more specific documents, to give a more detailed overview of that period in Portugal. So also our work on the statutes is a bit late. It's true that we do not have a lot of documentation, but just to reply to Ricardo, we do not know it. So we do not have contracts, apprenticeship contracts. Concerning the question by Professor Duarte, thank you. Thank you, colleague. Well, evidently, clearly, this is a quite more complex issue. The Crown and the guilds, they were for sure in a relationship, so they were for sure linked. So, but specifically in Portugal, actually, I posed myself this question more than once. So from the end of 15, start from 17th century, yes, again, the king was the one giving the last word, but I understand there was an interest by the king to support these systems, these organizations. So this is an important aspect. This is part of the link of the relationship. So this is a political issue concerning the trades. And actually, during the 15th century, over the 15th century, they tried actually to put some of the trades in the municipality, but that was at the end of the 15th century. So from then on, we passed on a more organized structure, so with supervisors, overseers, with councillors. So we have these figures present in the municipalities, and we have a developing organization, which then in certain cities so they will start to be kind of 12 main corporations and guilds. So this is a more structured and more organized body. That's starting from the 16th century. That's for sure in the interest of the crown to have this kind of more structured system. So I remember when we worked on this with my colleagues on a study about the 17th century in Portugal. So at a certain point, we read about some trades which actually did not exist anymore. But then they have been reintroduced by the king, holding them as important, as crucial to have them in the municipality, because, of course, these were more controlled. These were corporations and trades which were more controlled, like the trade unions, you know, also nowadays. Without nowadays, we risk to have upheavals and discussions. So from a certain point of view, the trade union is a tool to control. Yes, it is benefiting the laborers, the workers, but it's also good to have this organization to, you know, to organize the requests that are being made. So it's good to have, you know, it's good to have a spokesperson, like for Trump, for example, who could he talk to? So it's a way to facilitate the discussion and the dialogue. As Professor Duarte was saying, it's a way to limit the autonomy of the municipality, to increase the political importance of the municipality. So from this point of view, there's an interest of the corporations, so of the government in controlling the corporations.
Très intéressant la question que vous avez posée.
The question which has been asked many times. I got the impression that guilds, before they show up, we don't know how they are going to show up. They start with the work which has been already done by others in their place. As you already said, maybe I was not good in explaining my point, maybe, who knows. What I would like to say now, in the short time I had, I made just a long PhD study, many years. I've been working on trade associations in the 14th and 15th century. And so we also had this problem, the lack of documents. the lack of sources, but as you said, we find some documental evidences of the capabilities of the towns like Lisbon or Porto without having institutionalized organization who are capable of being organized, of doing something in common, and to have representatives recognized by the municipal authorities. This existed already before the appearance of guilds, in a very informal way, even before the appearance of the emergence of guilds. Depends on the specific trade association, of course, and each of them had strong political, social, economic power. But we didn't get any formalized organization yet. What I want to say, there was a lot of regulation on the activities of crafts at the end of the 16th century. But this regulation was issued by the municipal or communal authorities, often with the support or the dialogue with the crafts. But these were some public ordinances. It was not consistent. It was not a real statute. They were just a body of rules being published over the years. So at the end of the 15th century, the beginning of the 16th century, in Portugal, this changed. So there's a formal viewpoint which matters, a juridical viewpoint. So from one day to the other, we got the entire job done. But before the 16th century, from the formal viewpoint, it was long tradition. Over centuries, they got this practice of being informally organized for their claims, for their requests, also from the political viewpoint. And this is very important also in Portugal of the 14th and 15th century. Crafts. Which are leading some important claims. They got the capability of taking part in Corpus Christi procession without having any confraternities or brotherhoods. But they were able to take part in this Corpus Christi procession. And also the question for models. They knew the models quite well. From Castile and from the Aragon crown, they knew their models. They knew their models, the models that were used in Aragon, with all these forms of trade association. They knew these models, and as I said already, sometimes they tried. At the end of the 15th century, they tried to use these models, but for one reason or another, they didn't do so. The oligarchy of communes wanted to use these models, these organizational systems. They wanted to have a better definition of this all, but this was not possible. They knew the models, but they couldn't apply these models. There was no will to apply these models. For some reasons, it was not possible to implement these models, unfortunately. So there were a lot of influence from the outsiders models, one part of Europe, you already know, and also a strong heritage, more than 1 century, having this possibility of being better organized. So what's new from the legal viewpoint is having some rules to organize everything much better, and groups of institutions helping them to do so. But, of course, with some previous situations not to forget. One last but not least issue that has been raised so far from my communication is the relationship with confraternities and brotherhoods. Okay. So before the end of the 16th century in Portugal, we got just craft confraternities. These craft confraternities in Portugal, they were religious groups and charity groups, not professional groups. They were used to gather people all together, to putting people in these confraternity. There were also people being opponent to this because they wanted to get a sort of body spirit, esprit de corps. And so people were against the establishment of these confraternities. We have no documents confirming this sentiment, this feeling. In the 20th century, there was a theory. They really wanted, they wanted to present first the guilds, first confraternities and then guilds. They said confraternities were the result of guilds. This was just a theory launched in the 20th century, but now we have to reject this model. So there might be some cases where first and foremost we found the confraternity and then the guild. So we can say the guild has been the result of the establishment of the confraternity. But this is not the general model, because guilds exist. They also exist when the confraternity was pre-existing, and also confraternity exists when the confraternity is going to be established later on. So we have corporations established at the beginning of the century. So, and this confraternity has been established for religious reasons or welfare reasons. This is going to be very complicated in this. But it's going to be interesting to elaborate on this point as well. In Porto, there was one shoemaker's confraternity brotherhood of shoemakers, of cobblers. These cobblers at the end of the 15th century. So this was very, very interesting. This is fully documented. This a confraternity for cobblers. This is a very important confraternity, having far-reaching targets. They were just helping pilgrims during the pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela. This confraternity was exploited by cobblers, but these also had some welfare, help intention. So we got members in this confraternity, a lot of members. There was a confraternity of cobblers, but they were just to help the pilgrims. Okay, they were not for helping the shoemaker, but helping the pilgrims on their pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela. So this is a sort of a new way to get some additional prestige to the shoemaker or cobblers group. And it's going to be easier to get some donations on some properties to be stewed. So, because they want to help the pilgrims. And so they're going to receive more recognition, more gifts, and more donation by those who want to donate something. That's one important point not to neglect, There's a sort of genetic distinction between brotherhoods, confraternities, and guilds. It's too simple to say this. So it's possible that from the confraternity we have the guild, this can be possible, but it's not the general model.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Thank you all of you. Okay, do you have any additional questions to ask? Any additional question before leaving the room? So we're going to be back at 15 sharp in this same meeting room. Enjoy your meal. 3 p.m. back sharp. Thank you.